The first beginnings of the Falklands War can be traced all the way back to 1965 when the United Nations called upon Argentina and the United Kingdom to reach an agreement over the sovereignty of the islands. There were elements of the British Parliament willing to cede the islands over to the Argentinians, as the British viewed the islands as a nuisance to trade in the region. But members of the Parliament sympathetic to the islands lobbied against the ceding and made negotiations difficult, much to the dismay of the Argentinians. In the end, the negotiations were given up, except for a few Argentinian corporations working alongside British counterparts on the island. In 1977, British Prime Minister James Callaghan, in response to heightened tensions in the region and the Argentine occupation of Thule, secretly sent a force of Royal Navy frigates and a nuclear-powered submarine, the HMS Dreadnought, to the South Atlantic in Operation Journeyman. It is unknown whether or not the Argentinians were aware of the British presence, though British sources state that they were advised of their awareness through informal channels. In the end, tensions would die down for a bit and Operation Journeyman would be called off with the Royal Navy ships returning back to port. Later in 1980, UK Foreign Minister for Foreign Affairs Nicholas Ridley would respond to the situation of giving the islands to the Argentinians by saying, "If we don't do something, they will invade, and there is nothing we can do." In Argentina, following the transfer of power between the military dictators General George Rafael Videla and General Roberto Eduardo Viola in March of 1981, Argentina was in the midst of devastating economic stagnation and widespread civil unrest against the military junta that was ruling the country ever since 1976. There would be further change in the Argentinian high command, when a new junta headed by General Leopoldo Galtieri, Air Brigadier Basilio Lamy Dozo, and Admiral George Anaya would come to power. Anaya would be the main supporter of the invasion of the Falkland Islands, believing the British would be hesitant to respond militarily. With this, the Galtieri government hoped the invasion would spark widespread patriotism in Argentina and distract the citizens from the economic problems plaguing the country. The ongoing tensions between Argentina and the UK would pick up on March 19th, when a group of Argentinian scrap metal merchants would raise the Argentine flag on South Georgia Island, an act seen as the first offensive action of the war. The UK would dispatch a patrol vessel to check the Argentinian movements, and the Argentine High Command would see this as an act of war, signaling that the invasion of the island should begin on April 2nd. This would take the UK government aback, despite multiple warnings from the Royal Navy captain, Nicholas Barker. On April 2nd, 1982, Argentine forces launched Operation Rosario, the amphibious landings onto the Falklands to cede them into Argentinian control. The invasion would be met by a fierce but short defense organized by a garrison of 68 Royal Marines stationed on the island. The invasion would start with the landing of the Argentinian Amphibious Commandos Group, who would attack the vacant Moody Barracks and move onto the port of Stanley. It was not until the 2nd Marine Infantry's arrival, armed with American-made AAV-7s, when the Falklands governor would surrender and would be flown back into Argentina. They would later be repatriated back into the United Kingdom. Before this, the British would take action in response to the events in South Georgia and would send the Royal Auxiliary Fleet alongside the nuclear-powered submarines HMS Spartan and HMS Splendid. The day before, on April 1st, an emergency meeting would be held between Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the Chief of the Naval Staff Admiral Sir Henry Leach, with Leach advising that Britain could and should send a task force if the islands are invaded, with Leach sending orders to a fleet in the Mediterranean participating in exercises to prepare to sail south. On the day of the invasion, approval would be given for a task force to be formed to take back the islands. The first signs of the Argentinian presence on the island would be from Argentine sources, as well as multiple islanders via amateur radio. An emergency meeting would be held for UN members to adopt a resolution to the invasion, with United Nations Security Council Resolution 502 being passed on April 3rd with a landslide victory in UK intervention against the Argentinians. This would be the start of Operation Corporate, which was the code name of British military operations in the Falklands War, under Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse. The two aircraft carriers HMS Invisible and HMS Hermes and their escort vessels would set sail southward on April 5th. After coming back from an ocean cruise, the SS Canberra would be requisitioned to carry troops of the 3rd Commando Brigade to the island. The SS Queen Elizabeth II would also be requisitioned, carrying troops of the 5th Infantry Brigade. The whole task force would comprise about 127 ships, 43 Royal Navy vessels, 22 Royal Fleet auxiliary ships, and 62 merchant ships. The retaking of the Falklands would be viewed as extremely difficult, with the chances being assessed by the US Navy as a military impossibility. Firstly, the British would be constrained by a lack of deployable air cover, with 42 aircraft composed of 28 Sea Harriers and 14 Harrier GR-3s available. This would go against the 122 serviceable jet fighters in Argentina's Air Force during the war. The first landings would take place by SAS and SBS troops on April 21st, but a mission to establish a post on the Fortuna Glacier would be called off due to 2 helicopter crashes caused by fog and high winds. On April 25th, the ARA Santa Fe would be spotted by a Westland Wessex helicopter dropping depth charges after the submarine finished delivering supplies to Argentine forces. The submarine would be attacked by a Westland Wasp and a Westland Lynx, and would be hit by machine gun fire as well as torpedoes and AS-12 anti-ship missiles, causing the Santa Fe to be disabled and abandoned by its crew. With this, the British force would launch the mission to capture South Georgia, with the naval bombardment being demonstrated on the Argentine defenders. The Argentine force of 190 men would surrender without firing a shot. A message would be sent by the naval force declaring, "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the white ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen." The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, broke the news to the media, telling them to just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines. British operations would open up on May 1st with the Black Buck operations numbered 1 through 5. The mission of these operations would be to destroy the airfield at Stanley, to cripple the Argentine Air Force. Vulcan bombers on this mission would fly an 8,000-mile round trip from Ascension Island to drop conventional bombs on the airfield. The mission required frequent aerial refueling using Victor K-2 aircraft, and also required tanker-to-tanker refueling as well. The effectiveness of the raids is mixed, but the impact on Argentine morale was deemed worth it as they came to realize they were vulnerable to British firepower this far away from the home islands. The Black Buck raids would also score hits on radar stations in the area as well. The first major Argentine strike force, comprising 36 aircraft of A-4 Skyhawks, IAI Daggers, and English Electric Canberras, and also Mirage 3s. These aircraft would be sent on May 1st while under the belief that the British invasion was imminent or already happening. Only a section of the aircraft would find British ships which were firing on Argentine defenses on the island. The IAI Daggers would attack the ships and would manage to return back safely. This attack would improve Argentine pilot morale as the pilots of the Daggers proved they could survive the attacks of a modern British ship. Later in the day, another Dagger and a Canberra would be intercepted by BAE Sea Harriers and would be shot down. Combat would break out between British Sea Harrier fighters and Mirage 3 fighters. One Mirage 3 would be shot down by an AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missile, while the other escaped but was damaged and starved of fuel and was unable to return to base. This Mirage 3 would fly towards Stanley, where it was shot at by friendly Argentine forces. As a result of this experience, Argentine Air Force staff decided to deploy the A-4 Skyhawks and Daggers only in the strike role, Canberras during the night, and Mirage 3s as decoys to lure in British Sea Harriers to AA sites. These decoys would be expanded by a squadron of civilian jets flying 24 hours a day, which would simulate attacking aircraft. As a consequence of this strategy, a Learjet 35A was shot down on June 7th, killing the highest-ranking Argentine officer killed in the war, Commodore Rodolfo de la Colina. On April 30th, the British had brought a force into a 230-mile exclusion zone to replace the previous maritime exclusion zone, meaning that any ships or aircraft of any age in the zone were liable to attack from the British. Because of this, Argentine Admiral Anaya deployed all his available warships into 3 task groups, the first being centered around the aircraft carrier ARA 25 de Mayo, with 2 old missile-armed destroyers, the second being composed of 3 modern frigates, and a third group being led by the Second World War vintage ARA General Belgrano light cruiser approaching from the south. Despite her age, her large guns and heavy armor made her a serious threat, and she would be escorted by 2 modern Type 42 guided missiles destroyers. On May 1st, the British nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror located the Belgrano group and would stalk it. The commander of the submarine was aware of the carrier strike force en route to his position and ordered the Belgrano to be attacked to avoid a pincer movement from the carrier. The order to attack would be confirmed by the War Cabinet in London, and the General Belgrano was hit by 2 torpedoes at 4 p.m. local time on May 2nd and would sink an hour later. 321 members of General Belgrano's crew would die in the sinking. More than 700 men would be rescued from the open and stormy ocean, where they would endure up to 30 hours in overcrowded life rafts. The loss of the cruiser would become controversial in Latin American countries, though support for the British cause would not diminish. Despite this controversy, the sinking of the General Belgrano had a crucial strategic effect in eliminating the Argentine naval threat. After the sinking, the entire Argentine fleet except the submarine ARA San Luis would return to port and did not leave again during the Falklands War. This also caused the British to deploy submarines along the Argentine coast to warn the British task force of incoming and outgoing aircraft. 2 days later, after the sinking of General Belgrano, the British would lose the destroyer HMS Sheffield to an Argentine Exocet missile. The destroyer would be ordered forward with 2 other destroyers to provide radar support for aircraft. She would be struck with devastating effect, which would kill 20 crew members and injure 24 others. The ship would be abandoned several hours later, gutted and deformed from fires. The ship would be kept afloat, hoping it could attract Argentine submarines and lure them into a trap, though she would sink on May 10th east of the Falklands. In the landing zone, the main weakness of the British ship's anti-aircraft defenses were demonstrated when the HMS Ardent sank on May 21st after she was hit by 9 bombs, and when the HMS Antelope, when an attempted bomb defusal failed and the bombs exploded. Out at sea, the MV Atlantic Conveyor was struck by an air-launched Exocet on May 25th, which caused the loss of 3 out of 4 Chinooks and 5 Wessex helicopters on board, as well as maintenance and logistic equipment as well, which would serve as a severe blow from a logistical standpoint. HMS Coventry would be lost on May 25th while acting as a decoy to draw Argentine aircraft away from San Carlos Bay. The HMS Argonaut and the HMS Brilliant would be moderately damaged by bombs as well. Even though many ships were damaged, many British ships escaped being sunk because of limitations imposed on Argentine pilots. To avoid a high concentration of British AA defenses, Argentine pilots released bombs at very low altitude, and in some cases the bombs' fuses failed to prime and resulted in many dud bombs landing with no effect. The pilots were aware of this, but the high skill required to avoid SAM missiles and AA cannon fire as well as British Sea Harriers caused many to fail to climb to a safe point to a release. The Argentine forces would improvise with improvised bomb devices to make low-level bombing effective. 13 bombs are accounted as landing on British ships without detonating, with Lord Cragg remarking, 6 better fuses than we would have been lost. As a result of these low-level bombings, the Argentines lost 22 aircraft. During the night of May 21st, the British Amphibious Task Group launched Operation Sutton, the amphibious landing on beaches around San Carlos Water, on the northwestern coast of East Falkland facing onto Falkland Sound. The bay, known as Bomb Alley by British forces, was the scene of repeated air attacks by low-flying Argentine jets. The 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment from the Roro Ferry, Norland, and 40 Commando Royal Marines from the HMS Fearless were landed at San Carlos, designated Blue Beach. 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment from the HMS Intrepid was landed at Port San Carlos, designated Green Beach, and 45 Commando with RFA Stormness were landed at Ajax Bay, designated Red Beach. These units would total around 4,000 men landing in 8 LCUs and 8 LCVPs. They would encounter some Argentine resistance from mortars and recoilless rifles on shore, which would be met by British naval fire, and RAF Harrier would be shot down after conducting recon on Argentine forces as well. The British would ultimately claim victory at the cost of 3 killed and 1 wounded, while the Argentinians would suffer 6 killed and 8 captured after the battle. From early on May 27th until May 28th, 2nd Para approached and attacked Darwin and Goose Green, which was held by the Argentine 12th Infantry Regiment. 2nd Para's 500 men had naval gunfire support from the HMS Arrow and artillery support from 8th Commando Battery and the Royal Artillery. The British would encounter heavy resistance from the Argentine forces and would end up being pinned down under Argentine ambush, causing many British casualties. A British scout helicopter would be sent to evacuate wounded, but was shot down by an FMA IA-58 Bakura attack aircraft, resulting in the only Argentine air-to-air victory of the war. The British and Argentine forces would engage in bitter and heavy fighting as both tried to gain the initiative, but to no avail. As the British cleared Argentine positions on Darwin Hill, they came under intense direct fire from 35mm AA guns on the Goose Green airfield. These AA guns would destroy many buildings as well that were suspected British positions. These guns would be abandoned though as the attacking British drew closer and closer, and the guns also came under attack by British Harrier attack jets, which improved the morale among the troops significantly. Argentine attack jets would also support the retreating Argentines, resulting in one being shot down. Fighting would continue through the night and would result in an Argentine surrender, causing a British victory in the Battle of Goose Green. The British would suffer 18 killed and 64 wounded, while the Argentines would suffer 55 killed and 145 wounded, alongside 961 captured and 3 attack aircraft being shot down. Meanwhile, 42nd Commando prepared to move by helicopter to Mount Kent, but unknown to the British commandos was the Argentine plan to stop the British and hold Mount Kent at all costs. For the next week, SAS and Argentine forces waged intense patrol battles starting on May 29th. On May 30th, RAF Harriers became active over Mount Kent, which proved effective in ground attack missions against the Argentines. Top Mallow House would see an intense skirmish between Argentine and British forces, where Argentine forces became surrounded in a small shepherd's house. The Argentines eventually ran out of ammunition and were forced to surrender. The Argentines would also make use of helicopters to carry out wounded personnel, and as a result, one SA-330 Puma was shot down by an American-made FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missile on May 30th. The British would win the battle on June 11th, suffering 5 killed and 11 wounded, and also 1 Harrier shot down. Meanwhile, the Argentines would suffer 9 killed, 18 wounded, and 15 captured. By June 1st, with the arrival of 5,000 British troops at the 5th Infantry Brigade, the British had a sufficient force to start planning an offensive against Stanley. This would come to the attention of the Argentine Air Force, which would order attacks on Bluff Cove, which became a major British landing point where personnel and vehicles were unloaded in large numbers. On June 8th, while unloading, British ships came under attack from 5 Argentine Douglas A-4 Skyhawks. The Argentines would also send 5 IAI Daggers to fly north of the islands to lure out the British Sea Harriers to leave the British landing ships undefended. The RFA Sir Galahad would be badly damaged by 3 bombs dropped by the Skyhawks. RFA Sir Tristram was struck by 2 bombs from the Skyhawks as well. Sir Galahad suffered the most devastating effects, suffering 48 men being killed. A second wave of 4 more A-4 Skyhawks hit and sank an LCU from the HMS Fearless, killing 6 men. By this time, the Sea Harriers came in to respond to the attack and shot down 3 Skyhawks, though the last Skyhawk managed to return to base in Argentina. The attack would see the British suffer 56 killed and 450 wounded, alongside 1 landing ship and LCU sunk. The event would be recorded by ITV News and would become some of the most sombering images of the war. On the night of June 11th, British forces launched a night attack against the heavily defended ring of high ground surrounding Stanley. They would attack with support from naval gunfire from several Royal Navy ships. This would result in the Battle of Mount Harriet, Battle of Two Sisters, and Battle of Mount Longdon. Mount Harriet was taken at the cost of 37 British and 318 Argentine casualties. Two Sisters would see stiff Argentine resistance, but the British managed to capture their objectives, suffering 68 British and 124 Argentine casualties. The toughest battle would be at Mount Longdon, where they would be bogged down by intense rifle, mortar, artillery, sniper, and machine gun fire. The battle would result in 83 British casualties and around 201 Argentine casualties. Also during the battle, HMS Glamorgan would be struck by an improvised trailer-based Exocet missile, which resulted in 14 British men being killed. Wireless Ridge would be captured on June 13th with support by British light armor. This would cost 14 British casualties and 187 Argentine casualties. The final defense at Mount Tumbledown would result in a British victory as well, costing 44 British casualties and 105 Argentine casualties. With the defensive ring around Stanley breached, the Argentine defenses began to falter in Stanley. The British would enter Stanley and would find the Argentine positions abandoned, though they would be met by a mass surrender by Argentine forces. This would come as a massive victory in the Falklands War, with fighting on the island ending on June 14th with the ceasefire being declared. With this ceasefire, the Falklands War would end in a British victory. The Falklands War demonstrated that the British were still willing and able to defend their distant colonies no matter the cost. They won a conflict against all odds on an island chain thousands of miles away from London and the home islands. Though it may seem that the British Empire is a long-gone military force, the Falklands War proved that the British were capable of defending her distant colonies from foreign militaries and proved how competent and effective the British military was despite her fall from being a superpower. This victory would come at a cost for both sides, though, a cost that is too high to value. In total, 907 people were killed during the 74 days of the conflict, with Argentina suffering 649 servicemen killed, and the British suffering 255 servicemen killed. Additionally, there were 1,188 Argentine and 777 British injured or wounded. The names of the men who fought and died in the Falklands War will never be forgotten and will stand the test of time. The echoes of the effects of the Falklands War are still felt today, and they will not be forgotten anytime soon. The men will be honored no matter what, and though they paid the heaviest price of all, their sacrifice will never go unrecognized.